Okay, so here we are with our, Jacob, can you do the front two lights so we can see it a little bit crisper, cleaner? And we have our perspective grid. How do we turn on the perspective grid? Do you remember?
It's a thing on the left. It's got the little like perspective thingy. Yeah.
Yeah, perspective grid tool. If you turn it on by accident, it can be kind of a pain. Yeah, Matt had to figure out how do I get rid of it like a couple weeks ago. But we have your perspective grid. It shows up with a three-dimensional. Right now, what is my perspective in the three-dimensional world? We looked at a couple different ways we use perspective in creating a three-dimensional world. How many points do I have here for my perspective? Technically two, by the two-point perspective. We have a point here, a vanishing point. Well, yeah, there's lots of points, but the vanishing point, which we call the 2-point, one here and one here. I can adjust, once I have my grid open, I can adjust those points to change my vanishing points. By changing the vanishing points, that will change the look and layout. Key here is, if I change the look and layout of my perspective grid, but I've already got things on the grid, it's not going to change the things that are already in the grid. I can change it for different perspectives, and I can have technically more than 2 points by changing the grid every time I add an element. So what do? Well, I can create a shape using many different tools. So let's go into rectangle, ellipse, polygonal tool, star tool, whatever. Let's go and just create a rectangle, something simple. And I created, I've already got my point selected there, and it's putting that into my grid. No, there's the big takeaways that if you get nothing else from this class, is there's two different types of selection tools. We have the mice, where I can select and I can move that object. But notice as I select and move that object, it's not getting bigger or smaller with the grid. If I wanted to respond to the grid, I need to make sure I'm using, inside of here, my perspective selection tool. My perspective selection tool is underneath, you pull it out, there. Once that's there, now it will get bigger or smaller based on that grid. So as I move it around, it'll get further away, closer to that vanishing point. It'll get itty bitty living space, or it gets really big. But it has to be using the perspective selection tool, not the regular mouse tool. If I go to the regular mouse, it will just move it around in the piece, but it will not move it according to the grid. So you can control it independent from the grid with the top mice, or if you want to move it in line with the grid, you have to make sure you're using the perspective selection tool. Nothing else will frustrate you more using the perspective grid, minus how do I turn it off when I'm done with it, than getting the wrong selection tool. So we've used the two other ones, the white and the black mouse, and then we have the perspective selection tool if you actually want to change it on that grid, to move it through that grid. So I think, okay, I'm creating these boxes. It's just a white box. It's boring, yeah, yada, yada. Okay. What I need to do? Well, I can start to change that box. Once I have my box moved over, let's go ahead and change my fill color. Mr. Fill does lots of different things here. Go to my fill color, and I can change it to something else. Maybe something like that. Or a different solid color. So I can see what that looks like. Should note the perspective grid is only a grid. It's a preview. So this is actually, you can't actually change like the color of the grid. It's just kind of like an outline, like a guide. It's invisible. If you save the file like a JPEG or a PNG, it's not going to be there. Put it in a PDF, it's not going to be there. It's just kind of to give you an idea how that 2-point perspective or however many point perspectives you have looks. So it's invisible once we export it to an actual file, but it will be visible for the Illustrator purposes. James.
How do you get to this?
If you're in your fill, go into the library, and then you go into patterns, some different nature patterns. Into that. So you can choose all the different patterns. If you want to have like a cool looking, let's do an animal skin, because animal skins are cool. Peacock, alligator, cheetah, something like that. So I have all kinds of different fill colors, textures. I can start to put into a box. So as you start to create your, whatever, as a cityscape or a design or a package logo or whatever you're going to create for this 3D piece due next week, you can have that each box can go from there. So I have a box that have a particular color on it. Right now it's on the left point perspective, because that's the word the vanishing point is locked up to. I'm on My selection tool now, my perspective grid selection tool, I can move it over in that regard. If I also change the box, I can change the size of the box. That will change the order of what it's going to show up as. So if I have my box here, go to my selection perspective tool, I can move it to a different corner. Right now it's not selected, funny. Let's create a new box. There we go, let's create a new box. I have now this, according to the box, the cube up here is on the right grid. If I hold numbers 1, 2, or 3, I can change that grid number. I'm holding 1, or I click 1, that becomes the side here. I click 2, that's the bottom section. If I hold 3, that's the right section. So the numbers 1, 2, and 3 is all I have to push. Nothing besides 1, 2, or 3 will change the selection that you're going to draw the next shape. Right now, the next shape would be on that particular shape, on that particular line. When I switch over to 3, I'm not going to draw on a different line. So if you're confused, why is it only on the right line? Well, it's because it's on the right line, right grid, or the number 3. When I switch it over, I can do it from there. If I have a piece here, let's say I want to put it onto the other side. I want to flip sides. So I'm going to take this piece here, I want to move it to the other side, so it's the other direction. If I hold, I'm holding 1, that switches it over to blue. I hold 1, and now it will drag it over to the other side. By holding that number, I'll switch over to 3, and I'll push it back to the 3 angle. I'll hold 1, it goes back to the other angle, which is simplified. So on this angle, I want to flip sides, hold 3, drag it over, now it's on the other angle. Or if I want to put it on the bottom angle, I hit 2. This one gets kind of confusing because it's underneath it, technically the bottom angle. I can move it to a different perspective by holding 1, 2, or 3. Those are the basics of using the perspective grid tool. Moving around to your different angles. And make sure you're using the perspective selection tool, not the regular mouse tool if you want it to be on that grid. If I go back to the perspective grid tool, I can then start to change. So I have this angle, this one angle. Maybe I want to create like a different building or a different shape that's a different angle or different level. I can start to change the grid. Start to select some of the points, and I can change the perspective so it has a different vanishing point. Sometimes you want to zoom out a little bit and have these very wide vanishing points. So the perspective isn't quite so drastic. You can change those vanishing points. Something like that. I can zoom in so I can see my box better. Go back to my selection tool, create this, my leopard skin. Let's put it on the left side. Hit that particular left grid. Questions so far? We will get more complex. So if you're already confused, well, let's try to answer that confusion before we get further.
So when's the only time that we go to our free transform? When we're needing to
Like reshape the shape. If I go to free transform, I want to like just make it bigger, smaller. I can change it in there. If I go to if I want to change like the size of the box, if I want to like crop it smaller or make it longer or whatever, you'll do that for the free transform. You can do that. But if you're trying to make it move down the line in the perspective, you have to be on the perspective selection tool to actually move it around on that perspective. But you go to the free transform, which is fine. You can modify the shape when it's already in the grid, but it won't work quite the same. Perspective selection tool. Yep. So we have lots of options here. Think, well, I can't find what I'm looking for. I want maybe a grass texture or a sidewalk texture or something. Okay.